A cry in the dark. A chilling discovery. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Officer Greg Calloway walked his usual patrol route, his boots clicking against the empty sidewalk. He had been a police officer in Millbrook for nearly 15 years, and over time, the town had become predictable. The same streets, the same late-night drunks stumbling out of bars, the same occasional domestic dispute. But tonight felt different. There was a sharp chill in the air, more than just the weather. Something was wrong. Greg's hand hovered over the flashlight strapped to his belt as he scanned the dark alleyways between buildings. The yellow glow of streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Then he heard it. A sound so soft it could have been mistaken for a stray cat. A whimper. Greg stopped in his tracks, his heartbeat picking up. His years on the force had trained him to listen to his instincts. Slowly, he moved toward the sound, his fingers brushing against the cool metal of his holstered weapon just in case. The noise came from a narrow alley behind an abandoned laundromat, a place long forgotten by the town. The scent of rotting trash filled his nostrils as he approached a large, dented dumpster. A sudden movement made him freeze. Something, or someone, was inside. Greg hesitated for only a moment before gripping the edge of the dumpster and throwing the lid open. What he saw made his stomach clench. Curled up inside, buried beneath torn garbage bags and old newspapers, was a child. A small, frail boy. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. His dark skin was smudged with dirt, and his tiny frame trembled violently. His clothes, if they could be called that, were nothing more than rags, barely covering his thin body. His eyes, wide and fearful, reflected the dim glow of Greg's flashlight. Greg's breath caught in his throat. The boy looked up at him with sheer terror, pressing himself against the filthy metal as if trying to disappear. "Hey, buddy," Greg said gently, kneeling down. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The boy didn't respond. He only shrank back further. Greg's stomach twisted. He had seen some horrible things in his years on the force, but this, a child abandoned like this. He reached out a hand, moving slowly. "What's your name?" he asked. A long silence stretched between them. The boy stared at him, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape route. "Jordan," came the softest whisper. Greg exhaled slowly. "Progress." "Okay, Jordan," he said, his voice steady. "I need to get you out of here. You're not safe here." Still, the boy didn't move. Greg swallowed hard. He knew kids like this. He had been one once, the kind who had learned that adults weren't always safe, that trust was dangerous, that sometimes the people who were supposed to love you were the ones you had to fear the most. His chest ached. He reached into the dumpster carefully, wrapping his hands around Jordan's trembling frame. The boy stiffened but didn't resist as Greg lifted him out, cradling him in his arms. He was so light. Too light. Greg felt something stir inside him, an emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. Fury. Who had done this to him? Who had abandoned him like this? And why? Jordan whimpered as Greg carried him to the patrol car. The boy flinched when the car door opened, eyes darting wildly. "It's okay," Greg said softly. "Just a car. You're safe now." Jordan hesitated, then let himself be placed in the passenger seat. Greg buckled the seatbelt around him carefully, trying not to let his own emotions show. His fingers clenched around the steering wheel as he pulled onto the road. Whoever had done this, they were going to answer for it. A hospital and a promise. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Jordan sat rigid in the seat, his wide, wary eyes locked on Greg. Every time Greg glanced over, the boy would flinch, as if expecting something bad to happen. Greg's heart felt heavier with each passing mile. He had seen too many cases like this. Kids thrown away, discarded like they were nothing. He thought he had learned to harden himself against it. That after years on the force, he could treat these things like just another case. But looking at Jordan, so small and broken, something inside him cracked. When they arrived at Millbrook General, Greg lifted Jordan into his arms again. The boy didn't resist. He barely reacted at all. The hospital staff was quick to respond. A nurse rushed over, her eyes widening at the sight of the trembling child in Greg's arms. "What happened?" she asked, already ushering them into an exam room. "Found him in a dumpster," Greg said, his voice low, controlled. "He's malnourished, likely abandoned." The nurse's expression darkened. "Poor thing." Greg placed Jordan onto the hospital bed. The boy sat there stiffly, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone to hurt him. "Jordan," Greg said gently, kneeling beside the bed. "These people are going to help you, okay? They're going to make sure you're okay." Jordan didn't speak, but he gave the tiniest nod. Greg turned to the nurse. "I need to know if he's hurt." He stopped himself. He didn't want to say the words. He didn't want to think about what kind of abuse the boy might have suffered. "We'll check everything," the nurse assured him. "We'll take care of him." Greg exhaled, standing up. "I need to call social services." At that, Jordan's hand shot out, gripping Greg's sleeve with surprising strength. Greg looked down at him, startled. "Don't go," Jordan whispered. Greg's throat tightened. He hesitated, then gently placed a hand over the boy's. "I'm not going anywhere." It was a promise. The first clue. As Jordan was examined, Greg stood outside the hospital room, his jaw clenched. He had already called social services. They were sending someone over. But the thought of handing Jordan off to some overworked caseworker made his stomach churn. This kid had been abandoned once. Greg couldn't shake the feeling that if he let him go now, he'd be abandoned again. He needed to know what had happened. Pulling out his phone, he made a call. "Hey Martinez," he said when his fellow officer answered. "I need you to run a search. Missing child reports. Any recent cases involving a kid named Jordan." There was a pause. Then, "You found a kid." "Yeah," Greg said. "And I need to know where he came from." "I'll check the system," Martinez said. "Give me a few." Greg hung up and stared through the window into the hospital room. Jordan sat on the bed, knees drawn to his chest, watching the nurses with those same cautious eyes. Something about this didn't sit right. No one had reported him missing. No one was looking for him. Greg had a sinking feeling in his gut. Something was very, very wrong. And he was going to find out what. Shadows of the past. A fragile connection. The sterile white walls of Millbrook General Hospital felt suffocating. Officer Greg Calloway had never liked hospitals. The constant beeping of monitors, the scent of antiseptic, the quiet, anxious murmur of voices. But tonight, it wasn't the hospital itself that made his stomach churn. It was the boy. Jordan sat on the hospital bed, knees tucked into his chest, his dark eyes scanning the room like a caged animal. The doctors had examined him, confirming Greg's worst fears: severe malnutrition, old bruises that hinted at past injuries, signs of prolonged neglect. But it wasn't just his body that was wounded. It was something deeper. Something Greg recognized. The kid barely spoke. He didn't cry. He didn't even ask questions. That kind of silence wasn't normal, not for a child. It was the silence of someone who had learned that speaking up only brought pain. Greg knew that silence well. The social worker had come and gone, a tired-looking woman named Miss Willow. She had asked the usual questions, taken down notes, promised to find a temporary home. But when she turned to Jordan, offering him reassurances, the boy had said nothing. He had only clutched Greg's sleeve like a lifeline. Now, alone with the boy in the dimly lit hospital room, Greg was left with a decision he wasn't prepared for. "I gotta go, kid," Greg said, standing from the chair beside the bed. Jordan's fingers curled tighter around Greg's sleeve, his entire body tensed, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Greg sighed. "Damn it. All right," he muttered, sitting back down. "I'll stay a little longer." Jordan didn't relax, but his grip loosened slightly. It was the closest thing to trust Greg had seen from him all night. Greg exhaled and leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't built for this. He was a cop, not a babysitter. He dealt with criminals, not scared kids. But the way Jordan had clung to him. Greg shook his head. This wasn't supposed to happen. A name that shouldn't exist. Greg was still sitting beside Jordan when his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the caller ID. Martinez. His gut tightened. "Yeah," Greg answered, keeping his voice low. "Got something for you," Martinez said. Ran the name Jordan through the missing persons database. Came up with nothing. Greg frowned. Nothing. Not a damn thing. No missing child reports. No Amber Alerts. No concerned parents calling in. It's like the kid doesn't exist. Greg's eyes flicked to Jordan. The boy was staring down at his hands, his small fingers fidgeting with the hospital blanket. That didn't make sense. Every kid who went missing had someone looking for them. A parent, a grandparent, a neighbor. Somebody. "Expand the search," Greg said. "Look for Leah Carter." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Where'd you get that name?" Martinez asked. Greg hesitated before answering. When they had first arrived at the hospital, Jordan had whispered something under his breath. A name, barely audible. Mommy. Leah. It had been the only thing he had said voluntarily. "Just check," Greg said. "All right, hold on." Greg waited, his grip tightening around the phone. A few moments later, Martinez let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Leah Carter, reported missing 6 months ago." Greg's breath caught. "Where?" Last known address was in Edgewood, 2 towns over. She filed a restraining order against some guy a year before that. Real piece of work. Jason Calloway. Greg froze. The name hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Calloway. The same last name as his own. His pulse pounded in his ears. What's the connection? Martinez hesitated. "I don't know, man. Could be coincidence, but..." Greg didn't believe in coincidences. Not in a town like Millbrook. "Send me everything you have on Jason Calloway," Greg said. "You got it." Greg ended the call and stared at his phone screen. A sick feeling settled in his gut. He looked over at Jordan, who was still sitting motionless on the hospital bed. If Jason Calloway was his father, Greg clenched his jaw. This just got a hell of a lot more complicated. The past comes knocking. Greg barely slept that night. He sat in the hospital chair, one hand resting near his holster, his eyes half-lidded but never fully closing. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. At some point, Jordan had drifted off into a restless sleep, curled up against the hospital pillows, his small body tense even in unconsciousness. Greg watched over him. His mind kept circling back to Jason Calloway. He had heard the name before. Years ago, it had been buried in old police reports, whispered about in the department. An abusive bastard with gang connections. But Greg had never met him personally. Now, the name felt like a ghost from his past, clawing its way back into his life. At 3:00 a.m., his phone vibrated. He answered immediately. "I ran deeper checks," Martinez said, his voice grave. Jason Calloway was bad news. Man. Domestic abuse, drug charges, suspected trafficking. He was arrested 3 years ago, but charges didn't stick. Greg rubbed his forehead. And Leah. She vanished. No known relatives, no bank activity, nothing after that missing persons report. Greg's stomach churned. If Leah Carter had disappeared, did that mean Jason Calloway had found her? He looked at Jordan, sleeping uneasily. The kid had been alone for months, living on the streets, dumpster diving for food. Had Leah left him behind to keep him safe? Greg stood, his jaw tightening. He needed answers. A threat in the dark. By morning, Jordan was awake, staring blankly at the hospital window. Greg was about to ask if he was hungry when a nurse entered, holding a clipboard. "Officer Calloway," she said. "There's someone here to see you." Greg frowned. "Who?" "A man," she said hesitantly. "Said his name was Jason Calloway." Greg's blood ran cold. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pushed past the nurse, his pulse hammering. He reached the waiting area and spotted him immediately. A tall man, broad shoulders, dark stubble covering a sharp jawline. His eyes were cold, calculating. Jason Calloway. His own last name twisted into something ugly. Greg's fingers twitched toward his holster. He forced himself to stay calm. "Officer Calloway," Jason drawled, stepping forward. "I hear you've been asking about my son." Greg's jaw clenched. "Jordan." He knew. Greg squared his shoulders. "You abandoned that boy." Jason smirked. Now, who said I abandoned him?" His voice dropped lower. "Maybe I just lost him for a little while." Greg's grip tightened. Jordan had not been lost. He had been running. Greg's gut told him one thing. Jason Calloway wasn't here for Jordan because he cared. He was here because he wanted control. And Greg wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. Jason leaned in slightly, voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't want to get involved in this, Officer Calloway. This isn't your fight." Greg's voice was steady. "It is now." Jason's smirk faded. His eyes darkened. "Then you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Greg didn't blink. "I've made plenty." And with that, he turned his back on Jason Calloway. Because no matter what it took, no matter what danger lay ahead, Greg was going to protect Jordan. The boy, the ghost, and the fire. The threat that changed everything. Greg Calloway knew 2 things for certain. 1. Jason Calloway wasn't here to reunite with his son. He wasn't the kind of man to care about a kid he had abandoned. 2. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Standing in the hospital corridor, watching Jason's retreating figure, Greg felt an anger simmering inside him. An anger he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just another case. It was personal. Greg took a steadying breath before heading back to Jordan's room. The boy was still sitting on the hospital bed, his small frame hunched, his fingers twisting the thin blanket. His dark eyes flicked up as Greg entered. He didn't say anything, but Greg knew what he was thinking. Something's wrong. Greg forced a small smile. "Hey kid, you hungry?" Jordan hesitated before giving a tiny nod. Greg grabbed the hospital menu off the table and handed it to him. "Pick whatever you want." "My treat." The boy didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and pointed. "Pancakes," he whispered. Greg grinned. Good choice. As he walked to the nurse's station to order the food, his mind raced. Jason Calloway being in town was bad. Really bad. If he was sniffing around Jordan, it meant he either wanted the kid for leverage or to silence him completely. Greg wasn't about to let that happen. Not to Jordan. Not on his watch. A new plan, a new home. After breakfast, Miss Willow, the social worker, returned. She gave Greg a knowing look before stepping into the room, clipboard in hand. "Officer Calloway," she said, "we need to discuss Jordan's placement." Greg's stomach clenched. Jordan sat up straighter in bed, his eyes darting between them. His fingers clutched the blanket tighter. "Right," Greg said. "Where are we on that?" Miss Willow sighed. "We're still searching for any next of kin, but so far, we've come up empty. Without family, he'll be placed in temporary foster care." Jordan flinched at the words. He stared down at his lap, his small hands balling into fists. Greg exhaled. He knew what he had to say before he even opened his mouth. "What if I take him?" The words were out before he could second-guess himself. Miss Willow's eyebrows shot up. "You?" Jordan's head snapped up, eyes wide. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. "Yeah, just for now. until we figure something else out. Miss Willow studied him. Officer Calloway, taking in a foster child isn't something to be decided on a whim. I'm not deciding on a whim, Greg interrupted. His voice was firm, steady. The kid trusts me. He needs stability. You saw what happened when you tried to talk to him yesterday. He wouldn't even look at you. He's been through hell, Miss Willow. He needs someone he trusts. Miss Willow pursed her lips, flipping through her notes. We'd have to do a background check, a home visit. Do whatever you need to, Greg said, but I'm not letting him get lost in the system. Miss Willow studied him for a long moment. Then she turned to Jordan. What do you think, Jordan? She asked gently. The boy didn't answer right away. He looked at Greg, eyes searching, as if trying to figure out if this was real, if this was safe. Then slowly he nodded. Greg felt something shift inside him. All right, Miss Willow said with a small smile. I'll start the paperwork. A house too quiet. That evening, Greg pulled his patrol car into his driveway. Jordan sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching the small backpack of belongings the hospital had given him. A toothbrush, a change of clothes, and a stuffed bear. Greg shut off the engine and turned to the boy. All right, kid. Home sweet home. Jordan didn't say anything. Greg sighed and got out, walking around to open the door for him. Jordan climbed out cautiously, his small shoulders drawn in tight. Greg led him inside. The house was neat, clean, but bare. No family photos, no decorations, just a plain couch, a small kitchen table, and a TV that rarely got turned on. Greg suddenly realized how unprepared he was for this. He glanced at Jordan, who stood near the doorway, looking smaller than ever. Well, Greg said awkwardly, rubbing his neck. Guess I should show you your room. Jordan nodded stiffly. Greg led him down the hallway and opened the door to the spare bedroom. It was plain, just a bed, a dresser, and a lamp. I'll get you some better stuff soon, Greg said, feeling self-conscious. Maybe we can pick out some things together. Jordan nodded again. Greg exhaled. All right. Well, are you hungry? A small shake of the head. Greg frowned but didn't push. Okay. If you need anything, I'm just down the hall. Jordan hesitated before stepping inside. He set his backpack on the bed but didn't sit down. Greg lingered in the doorway for a second before forcing himself to leave. He had no idea what the hell he was doing. A nightmare that wasn't a dream. Greg woke to the sound of screaming. He was out of bed in seconds, his police instincts kicking in as he reached for his gun. But then he realized the screams weren't from outside. They were from Jordan's room. Greg threw open the door. Jordan was curled up in the corner of the bed, shaking violently. His tiny fists clutched the blanket, his eyes wild with terror. Greg's heart clenched. He had seen fear before. Real fear. But this was something else. Greg sat on the edge of the bed. Hey, kid. It's okay. You're safe. Jordan didn't move. Greg hesitated, then did something he hadn't done in years, something that felt foreign, but right. He reached out, gently placing a hand on Jordan's shoulder. Jordan flinched, but he didn't pull away. It's all right, Greg murmured. Nobody's gonna hurt you here. For a long time, Jordan didn't say anything. Then, in a whisper so quiet Greg almost missed it, he said, He found me before. Greg's blood ran cold. His grip on Jordan's shoulder tightened slightly. Who found you? Jordan's lips trembled. My dad. Greg's jaw clenched. Jason Calloway. Jordan looked up, his small face pale in the moonlight. He always finds us, he whispered, even when Mommy tried to hide. Greg's stomach twisted. Jason wasn't just dangerous. He was hunting them. Greg exhaled, forcing his voice to stay calm. He's not gonna find you this time, Jordan. I promise. Jordan's eyes searched his face as if trying to believe him. Greg wasn't sure if he did. the fire that started it all. The next morning, Greg got a call. He answered it, expecting Martinez or Miss Willow. But the moment he heard the voice on the other end, his entire body went rigid. "Officer Calloway." Jason Calloway's voice drawled. "I hear you took in my boy." Greg's fingers tightened around the phone. "You don't get to call them that," he said, his voice deadly calm. Jason chuckled. "Relax, officer. I just wanted to congratulate you. Real good Samaritan move." Greg's gut told him something was wrong. Then Jason's voice dropped. "You might want to check your back door." The line went dead. Greg's heart slammed into his ribs. He sprinted through the house, yanking open the back door, and stopped cold. A single, smoldering match lay on the porch. Beside it, a folded piece of paper. Greg picked it up with shaking hands. Inside, scrawled in uneven, angry handwriting, were 4 words. "He belongs to me." Greg clenched his jaw, his entire body burning with rage. Jason had just made a mistake. A big one. Because now, this wasn't just about protecting Jordan. This was war. A war no one saw coming. The fire that ignited everything. The match burned itself out on Greg Calloway's back porch, but the fire inside him raged hotter than ever. Jason Calloway had crossed a line. Greg clenched the note in his fist. His breathing was slow, controlled, but the tension in his shoulders was anything but. He had been a cop for years. He had dealt with criminals, drug dealers, and violent offenders. But this was personal. Jordan was just a kid who had been through hell. And now Jason, his so-called father, was trying to drag him back into it. Not happening. Not on Greg's watch. He turned sharply, stepping back into the house. Jordan was sitting at the kitchen table, his small hands curled around a glass of water. He had been quiet all morning, barely speaking since last night's nightmare. But when he saw Greg's face, his eyes flickered with something close to fear. Greg forced himself to take a breath, to push down the anger clawing at his chest. "Everything okay?" Jordan asked softly. Greg hesitated, his fingers tightening around the note behind his back. He didn't want to scare the kid, but he also didn't want to lie to him. "We need to talk," Greg said finally, sitting across from him. Jordan straightened. He didn't say anything, but Greg could tell he was bracing for something bad. Greg set the note on the table. Jordan's eyes flickered to it, then back to Greg. "Your father left this," Greg said. Jordan swallowed hard. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. "What does it say?" Greg hesitated, then read it aloud. "He belongs to me." Jordan flinched. Greg's stomach twisted. He knew what it felt like to be a kid and think the past could never let you go. He knew what it was like to feel hunted. "He's not getting to you," Greg said firmly. "Not now. Not ever." Jordan's gaze flickered to him, searching. He didn't look entirely convinced. Greg leaned forward. "I mean it, Jordan. No matter what happens, I'm not letting him hurt you." Jordan bit his lip. He looked away. Greg exhaled slowly. How do I reach him? He was used to solving problems with action, with rules and procedures. But this wasn't that kind of problem. This was a kid who had been failed too many times. Silence stretched between them until Jordan finally spoke. "My mom used to say that too," he whispered. Greg's breath hitched. "She said she'd keep me safe," Jordan continued. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something deep, something broken. "But he always found us, no matter where we went." Greg's fists curled against the table. Not this time. A plan in motion. Greg made 2 calls that morning. The first was to Officer Martinez. "You need to run a deep search on Jason Calloway," Greg said. "I don't care if you have to dig through every record in the state. I need to know where he's been, who he's been talking to, and what the hell he's planning." Martinez didn't ask questions. "I'm on it." The second call was to Captain Johnson. "I need a favor," Greg said. The captain sighed. I already heard. Your new house guest is causing a stir. Greg ignored the jab. Jason Calloway is back. He's making threats. Silence. Then, you think he's a real threat? Greg looked at Jordan, who was staring blankly at his hands. Yes, he said, and I want to put him down before he gets the chance to act. Another pause. Then, I'll see what I can do. Greg hung up, his mind whirling. He knew Jason wouldn't stop with an idle threat. The man was a predator, and predators didn't warn their prey unless they were playing with them. Greg had to be ready, and he had to do something he had never done before. Let someone in. A ghost from Greg's past. That evening, Greg took Jordan to the backyard. The boy needed to get out of the house, even if it was just for a few minutes. The yard was small but quiet. Safe. Greg grabbed a couple of chairs and set them up. Jordan sat stiffly. Greg let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. I know what it's like, he said. Jordan looked at him, confused. Greg hesitated. He hadn't spoken about his past in years. But if it could help Jordan trust him, if it could make the kid feel like he wasn't alone, it was worth it. My dad wasn't a good man either, Greg admitted. His voice was rougher than he intended. He hurt people. Hurt me. Jordan blinked. You? Greg nodded, staring at the sky. Yeah, me. Jordan was quiet for a long moment. Then he whispered, Did you run away too? Greg's chest tightened. He didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, he hadn't run. He had been too scared. He had stayed until the day his father got himself killed in a bar fight, leaving Greg alone in the world. I didn't run, Greg said eventually, but I wanted to. Every day. Jordan looked down. Greg took a breath. But I'll tell you this. I made a promise to myself a long time ago. I wouldn't let anyone else go through what I did. He turned to Jordan, his expression serious. That's why I won't let him take you. Jordan stared at him. And then, for the first time, Greg saw it. Hope. Faint, fragile, but it was there. The attack. The knock at the door came at 1:00 a.m. Greg was already awake. His instincts screamed at him. He moved quickly, stepping toward the front door, gun in hand. The porch light was on, but no one was there. And then, crash. The back window shattered. Greg spun, his pulse spiking. They're inside. He moved fast, gun raised. Jordan. He needed to get to Jordan. A dark figure lunged from the shadows. Greg barely dodged, throwing a hard punch to the attacker's ribs. The man grunted but kept coming. Greg fired. The gunshot exploded in the small house, sending the man stumbling back, clutching his shoulder. Jordan, Greg shouted. Footsteps, small, frantic. Jordan appeared in the hallway, his eyes wide with terror. Greg grabbed him, shoving him behind him. Stay down. More footsteps outside. More shadows moving. There were more of them. Greg clenched his jaw. Jason Calloway wasn't here to talk. He had sent men to take Jordan. Over my dead body. Another man lunged through the broken window. Greg fired again, but the guy was fast. He tackled Greg hard, sending them both crashing into the wall. Jordan screamed. Adrenaline surged through Greg's veins. He slammed his elbow into the guy's face, feeling the crunch of bone. The man crumpled, groaning. Greg. Jordan's voice was shrill, terrified. Greg turned. The front door had been kicked open. And standing there, smirking, was Jason Calloway. Didn't I tell you? Jason sneered. He belongs to me. Greg's grip tightened on the gun. His vision tunneled. Jason had come for Jordan. But Jason had made a mistake. Because Greg wasn't that scared kid anymore. He was a cop. A fighter. A protector. And he was going to end this. Right here. Right now. Face to face with a monster. Greg Calloway didn't hesitate. His gun was already aimed at Jason Calloway's chest. The safety was off. His finger was on the trigger. One wrong move, and Jason would be dead before he could take another step. But Jason didn't look scared. He looked amused. "Easy there, officer," Jason said, stepping inside like he owned the place. "No need for violence." Greg's eyes flickered to Jordan, who was crouched behind the kitchen table, his small body trembling. He was watching Jason with the kind of fear that ran deep, the kind of fear that had been drilled into him over time. Greg clenched his jaw. "Hands where I can see them," Greg ordered. Jason smirked but complied, raising his hands lazily. "Relax," Jason said, glancing around the house. "Nice place. Bit plain, though. Not really built for a kid, huh?" Greg's grip on the gun tightened. "You've got 5 seconds to turn around and walk out of here." Jason laughed. Actually laughed. "You think this is gonna end just because you say so?" Jason took a slow step forward. "You don't know who you're messing with, Calloway." The name sent a jolt through Greg's chest. His last name. Jason's last name. It made Greg sick. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Greg said, voice cold. "And I don't give a damn what gang you're running with. You don't get to lay a hand on this boy again." Jason's smirk twitched. "You think you're his savior?" Jason scoffed. "He's mine. He's my blood. You're nothing." Jordan whimpered softly from behind the table. Greg saw red. "You lost any right to call yourself his father the day you threw him away," Greg growled. Jason's expression darkened. "I didn't throw him away. I lost track of him." He shot a glare at Jordan. "Kid should have stayed where I put him." Greg took a step closer, keeping his gun steady. "You put him in a dumpster." Jason shrugged. "He survived, didn't he?" Greg's stomach twisted. This was a sick man. A man who saw Jordan as nothing more than a possession. And men like Jason didn't stop. They didn't change. They didn't quit until someone forced them to. Greg's finger hovered over the trigger. He could end this right now. He could put Jason Calloway in the ground and make sure he never came near Jordan again. But he wasn't a killer. He was a cop. Greg took a slow breath. "You're under arrest." Jason chuckled. "For what?" "Breaking and entering," Greg said. "Sending armed men into my house. Threatening a child." Jason rolled his eyes. "Oh, please. My guys were just trying to get my son back. I was worried about him. What kind of father wouldn't be?" Greg could hear the sarcasm dripping from his voice. But before Greg could respond, Jason's smirk widened. "And even if you arrest me," Jason said, voice low, dangerous, "you think that changes anything?" Greg's stomach clenched. Jason leaned in slightly. "I've got people everywhere, Calloway. You can throw me in a cage, but I won't stay there long." His eyes flickered toward Jordan. "And when I get out, I'll come back. I'll always come back." Greg's heart pounded. He knew the type. Men like Jason didn't get scared of the law. They owned people. Judges. Cops. Criminals. A regular arrest wouldn't stop him. It wouldn't stop any of them. Which meant Greg had one option left. He needed to take Jason down. For good. But first, he had to get Jordan out of danger. Escape plan. Greg moved fast. He reached behind him, grabbing his backup pistol from the small of his back. Without hesitation, he tossed it to Jordan. The boy's eyes widened as he caught it. "Stay behind the table," Greg said quickly. "If anyone but me comes near you, you point that at them and pull the trigger." Jordan's hands trembled as he gripped the weapon. But you won't need to," Greg promised. "Just hold on to it." Jordan swallowed hard but nodded. Jason let out a sharp laugh. "You're giving a gun to a kid." Greg turned back to him, gun still raised. "Jordan isn't the one you should be worrying about." Jason grinned, and then he moved. Fast. Greg barely had time to react. Jason lunged, grabbing the barrel of Greg's gun and twisting. The weapon fired. A deafening bang, but the shot went wide, burying itself into the ceiling. Greg grunted as Jason shoved him back. The two men slammed into the kitchen counter, knocking over dishes and scattering utensils. Jason threw a wild punch, but Greg ducked and slammed his elbow into Jason's ribs. Jason stumbled but recovered quickly. He was strong. Greg barely had time to block the next punch. Jason's knuckles grazed his jaw, sending a sharp burst of pain through his skull. Greg growled and shoved Jason hard. The man stumbled back into the living room. Greg moved to grab his gun from the floor, but Jason was faster. He kicked it away. "Not bad," Jason admitted, shaking out his fist. "You fight like you've seen some shit." Greg didn't respond. He just raised his fists. Jason smirked. "All right then. Let's finish this." The fight that decided everything. Jason threw the first punch. Greg dodged. Barely. Jason came at him again, swinging harder, faster. Greg blocked the hits, absorbing the impact, but Jason was relentless. Greg knew he couldn't match Jason's brute strength. The man was built for brawls, for breaking people. So Greg fought smart. He let Jason swing wide, and as he overextended, Greg ducked and landed a sharp punch to Jason's ribs. The crack was satisfying. Jason grunted, stumbling back. Greg didn't let him recover. He followed up with a hard elbow to Jason's gut, then slammed his knee into the man's chest. Jason hit the floor hard. Greg didn't hesitate. He grabbed his fallen gun, cocked it, and aimed it squarely at Jason's forehead. Jason grinned up at him, bloody and beaten. "You won't do it," Jason panted. Greg's jaw clenched. His hand was steady. His heart pounded in his ears. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But he didn't. Instead, he flipped Jason onto his stomach and slapped handcuffs onto his wrists. Jason groaned. "You're making a mistake." "No," Greg said, breathing hard. "I'm fixing one." The end of Jason Calloway. By the time backup arrived, Jason was unconscious. Greg stood in the wrecked living room, chest heaving, knuckles bruised. He barely heard Martinez as he rushed inside, gun drawn. "Jesus," Martinez muttered. "What the hell happened?" Greg exhaled. "He happened." Martinez glanced down at Jason's limp body. "Damn, you really pissed this guy off." Greg turned. Jordan was still crouched behind the kitchen table, clutching the gun Greg had given him. His hands were shaking. Greg's heart clenched. He walked over and crouched down. "Hey, kid." Jordan looked up at him, his eyes wide. Greg held out his hand. "It's over." Jordan hesitated. Then, slowly, he placed the gun in Greg's hand. Greg ruffled his hair. "Told you I wouldn't let him get you." For the first time, Jordan smiled. And for the first time, Greg felt something inside him settle. Jason Calloway was done. And Jordan was finally safe. The boy who lived. The man who stayed. A house that no longer feels like a home. The living room was a mess. Blood smeared across the floor. The coffee table had been overturned, and the shattered remnants of a picture frame lay scattered near the doorway. The house, once quiet and orderly, had been torn apart by the storm of Jason Calloway's rage. But it was over. Jason was in cuffs, shoved into the back of a patrol car. He wouldn't be coming back. Not this time. Greg Calloway stood on the porch, watching as Martinez and the other officers secured the crime scene. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the neighborhood in an eerie glow. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad movie. Greg had been in shootouts before. He'd broken up bar fights and tackled drug dealers in dark alleys. But this, fighting off an armed gang to protect a kid who wasn't even his. This was different. This was personal. He turned back toward the house. Jordan was still inside. The boy hadn't moved from the kitchen. He sat curled up on one of the dining chairs, arms wrapped around himself, his small frame trembling. Greg exhaled and stepped inside. his boots crunching over broken glass. "Hey, kid." Jordan flinched but didn't look up. Greg pulled out a chair and sat across from him. He could see the fear still lingering in the boy's eyes, even though the danger was gone. "He's not coming back," Greg said quietly. "I promise." Jordan swallowed, his fingers gripping the hem of his oversized t-shirt. "That's what Mom used to say." Greg felt something crack in his chest. "She said he wouldn't find us," Jordan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he always did." Greg's jaw clenched. He wanted to tell the kid that this time was different, that Jason Calloway was done, that Greg would never let him near Jordan again. But Jordan had been lied to too many times. So instead, Greg reached across the table, his palm open. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said. "That's not a promise. That's a fact." Jordan hesitated. His small fingers twitched. Then, slowly, he reached out, resting his hand in Greg's. A silent agreement. An understanding. Greg squeezed lightly, then let go. "Come on, kid," he said, standing up. "Let's get you out of here. A safe place." Greg didn't take Jordan to another foster home. He didn't trust the system. Not after seeing too many kids fall through the cracks, shuffled from place to place until they disappeared entirely. Instead, he took him somewhere safe. The house belonged to Mrs. Calloway. Not his mother. His grandmother. An old woman with sharp eyes and a voice like thunder. A woman who had raised Greg after his own parents failed him. The moment she opened the door, her expression shifted from annoyance to concern. "Boy, what the hell happened to your face?" Greg winced, touching the bruise forming along his jaw. "Long night." Her gaze flicked down. She spotted Jordan hiding behind Greg's leg. She frowned. "Who's this?" Greg exhaled. "His name's Jordan. He needs a place to stay." Mrs. Calloway studied the boy. "He in trouble?" Greg shook his head. His dad was. That was all she needed to hear. She stepped aside. "Well, get inside before you let all the cold air out." Learning to breathe again. The days that followed were strange. For the first time in his life, Greg wasn't just a cop. He wasn't chasing criminals or running investigations. He wasn't filling out reports or sitting behind a desk at the precinct. He was taking care of a kid. Jordan was quiet at first. He barely spoke unless spoken to, his dark eyes always watching, always waiting for something bad to happen. Greg recognized the signs. He had been the same way as a kid. So he didn't push. Instead, he took things slow. He taught Jordan how to make pancakes the right way. Extra syrup, just like he liked them. They watched old detective shows together. Jordan liked the ones where the good guys always won. They went to the park, where Greg let Jordan run wild, finally able to act like a kid for once. And slowly, Jordan began to trust him. One evening, as Greg was cleaning up after dinner, he heard soft footsteps behind him. "Greg?" He turned, surprised. Jordan rarely spoke first. "Yeah, kid." Jordan hesitated, shifting his weight. Then he said, "You really think my mom is alive?" Greg's heart clenched. He had been looking. Every night after Jordan went to bed, he combed through old police reports, searched missing persons databases, reached out to every contact he had. So far, nothing. But he couldn't tell Jordan that. Instead, he crouched down to meet the boy's gaze. "I'm gonna find her," he said. "No matter what it takes." Jordan studied him for a long moment. Then, without warning, he wrapped his arms around Greg in a tight hug. Greg froze. He wasn't used to this. Affection. Emotion. But then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around the boy in return. "I miss her," Jordan whispered. Greg's throat tightened. "I know, kid." And he meant it. A ghost resurfaces. 3 weeks later, Greg got a call that changed everything. He was sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, watching Jordan play in the yard. The boy had changed since that first night. He was laughing now. Running. Living. Then his phone buzzed. Greg glanced at the caller ID. Martinez. He answered. Yeah? You're gonna want to hear this, Martinez said. We found her. Greg sat up straight. What? Leah Carter, Jordan's mom. She's alive. Greg's heart pounded. Where? Small town about 50 miles from here. She's been living under a fake name, Nina Thompson. But get this, she checked herself into a hospital last night. Beat up real bad. Someone went after her. Greg's stomach turned to ice. Jason Calloway might have been in custody, but that didn't mean his people were. I'm going to get her, Greg said. You sure that's a good idea? Martinez asked. If someone tried to kill her, they might still be watching. I don't care, Greg said. Jordan deserves to see his mom again. There was a pause. Then Martinez sighed. All right. I'll text you the address. Be careful. Greg hung up. Jordan ran up to him, grinning. Did you see that? I jumped so high off the swing. Greg forced a smile. Nice one, kid. Jordan beamed. Then he noticed the look in Greg's eyes. His smile faded. What's wrong? Greg took a deep breath. Jordan, he said carefully, I think I found your mom. Jordan's eyes widened. His hands clenched into fists. Really? He whispered. Greg nodded. Jordan swallowed hard. Can we go? Greg hesitated. He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell the kid to stay put, to let Greg handle it. But Jordan deserved better than that. He deserved the truth. He deserved his family back. Greg ruffled his hair. Yeah, kid, we're going. And with that, he grabbed his keys and together, they drove toward the next chapter of their lives. The road to family and fire, a journey with no map. Greg Calloway had been on plenty of road trips. Some were long stakeouts in the dead of night, following criminals through back roads and alleys. Some were fast, adrenaline-pumping pursuits where the siren screamed louder than his own thoughts. But this was different. The boy sitting in the passenger seat wasn't a suspect, a witness, or a victim he could just hand off to the system. He was Jordan. And Greg had never been more terrified in his life. Jordan was silent as they drove. His hands gripped the seatbelt across his chest. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, as if afraid the destination would disappear if he blinked. He had asked Greg at least 10 times if this was real. Greg had answered the same way every time. Yeah, kid, it's real. But part of Greg didn't believe it either. Leah Carter, the mother Jordan had been searching for in every shadow, in every whisper of the wind, in every dark dream. The mother Greg had promised to find. And now she was out there, waiting, hurt, alone, and in danger. Greg tightened his grip on the wheel. They had to get to her before someone else did. A small town hiding a big secret. The hospital was a rundown brick building on the outskirts of a town that barely had a name. Greg parked the car, his heart hammering. Jordan didn't move. The kid had been jittery the whole drive, but now he was frozen. Greg turned to him. You ready, kid? Jordan swallowed hard. What if she doesn't want me? Greg's throat tightened. She's your mom, he said firmly. She wants you. Jordan nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Greg got out of the car, walked around, and opened the passenger door. He crouched down so he was eye level with Jordan. No matter what happens in there, Greg said, you're not alone. Got it. Jordan hesitated, then nodded. Greg held out his hand. Jordan took it. Together, they walked inside. A mother and a son, separated by fear. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. Greg approached the front desk. The nurse barely glanced up before he flashed his badge. Leah Carter, he said. Room number. The nurse hesitated, then checked her screen. Room 312. Greg nodded. Thanks. Jordan tugged on Greg's sleeve. Do I just walk in? Greg hesitated. He could tell Jordan was terrified. The kid had spent months convincing himself that his mother was either gone or had abandoned him. Now, standing on the other side of a hospital door, he had to face the truth. Greg knelt down. "You don't have to go in if you're not ready." Jordan looked at the door, then at Greg. Then, before Greg could say anything else, he pushed the door open. Reunion. The room was small. The curtains were drawn, and the only light came from a flickering lamp in the corner. Leah Carter was sitting up in bed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked thin, pale, like she had been running for far too long. Greg had seen her picture in old reports, but this wasn't the same woman. This was someone who had been broken and built herself back up so many times, she barely had the strength to stand anymore. Leah's eyes flickered up. For a moment, she just stared. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Jordan." Jordan stood frozen in the doorway. His lip trembled. His fingers curled into his sleeves. "Mom." Leah let out a strangled sob. Then she ran. Tubes ripped from her arm. Machines beeped in protest, but she didn't care. She collapsed onto her knees in front of Jordan, clutching his small face between her trembling hands. "My baby," she whispered. "Oh my God, my baby." Jordan whimpered, then threw himself into her arms. Leah sobbed into his hair. Her fingers ran over his back, his shoulders, as if trying to convince herself that he was real. Greg turned away. He gave them the moment. He had never believed in God, or fate, or anything bigger than the choices people made. But seeing that mother hold her son again, after everything they had been through, it felt like something holy. The hunter in the shadows. Greg didn't let his guard down. Because as beautiful as this moment was, there was still one problem. Someone had tried to kill Leah. And whoever it was, they might still be out there. Greg stepped into the hallway, pulling out his phone. He dialed Martinez. "You're on speaker," Martins answered. "I'm in a meeting with the captain." "Good," Greg said, "because I need both of you to listen. Leah Carter is alive, but she was attacked. Someone's cleaning up loose ends." A pause. Then the captain spoke. "Who do you think it was?" Greg clenched his jaw. "Jason Calloway's gang." Martinez cursed. The captain sighed. "Jason's in prison. He's got no power from in there." Greg shook his head. "Guys like Jason don't need power. They have people." Silence. Then Martinez asked the question Greg had been dreading. "What if they come after Jordan?" Greg's grip tightened on his phone. "They won't." He ended the call. "Because if they tried, Greg would make damn sure they never tried again." Fire and fury. Greg didn't sleep that night. He stayed by Leah's door, gun on his lap, eyes sharp. Jordan curled up in a chair beside his mother's hospital bed, refusing to leave her side. For the first time in months, he slept peacefully. And for the first time in years, Greg felt alive. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He wasn't just some guy passing through. He had a purpose. He had a family. And if Jason's men came, if they tried to take one more thing from him, Greg Calloway would make them regret ever trying. Because this wasn't just Jordan's war anymore. It was his. And Greg Calloway, he never lost a fight.